sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there were two efforts. One was the Meccan effort and one was the Medinan effort. The Meccan effort of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the effort of Darul Arqam. This is where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would gather in the house of Arqam radiallahu an, and he would give them and he would teach the Quran to them. The syllabus was the Quran, and the students were Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, and the rest of the Sahaba that had accepted Islam. So he would use this opportunity to teach them the Quran, do the tarbiyah and the rectification of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, those who had accepted Islam. Within the Meccan phase, is only a few that accepted Islam. Anyone know the number? Any ideas? It's a bit more than 80.
81.
Roughly, let's say it was at least 150 who had accepted Islam. At most, it will be no more than 300. No more than. So imagine this was 13 years of effort of the Prophet ﷺ. And his focus was on the Meccan Sahaba, do the tarbiyah, the islah, the rectification, and so on. So at least 150 to about 300 had accepted Islam during the Meccan phase. So this was the effort of the Prophet ﷺ. And the effort was on the hearts of the Sahaba. In the Meccan phase, there were no ahkam. 5 times salah became fard right in the end of the Meccan phase. There's no fasting in the month of Ramadan. There's no giving zakat. There's no prohibition on alcohol, and so on. What the Prophet made effort on was creating individuals that love Allah, love the Messenger, willingness to sacrifice and go through difficulty for the sake of Islam. Those, and correcting their akhlaq, their character, their morals, their ethics. It was about, the effort was in creating individuals capable of leading the ummah. That once they migrate, they can go to and set up the Medinan state. Now you have leaders be able to distribute the roles amongst the 13, amongst the 150 or 300 of the companions. So this was the effort of the Meccan phase, creating rijal, creating men and women capable of leading the ummah. So then the Prophet ﷺ, he went to Medina, and this is when the Muslim community was now organized. And the effort now wasn't the Darul Arqam effort. The effort was now that you've got about 150 to 300 companions who understand Islam, who have the tarbiyah of Islam, who are willing to sacrifice everything and anything for the sake of Islam. Now when you go to Ansar, when you go to Medina, now you've got all these fresh new converts. Who did the Prophet send to Medina for them to enter into Islam? Musab ibn Umair. How old was he when he went to Medina? He's about 20 years old. So he chooses, imagine, from amongst the converts of Makkah, he chooses a 20-year-old for the most, you can probably say, the most important da'wah in the history of Islam. He chooses a 20-year-old. It shows how the Prophet done the tarbiyah of the youth around him. And generally when we talk about the Sahaba, the average age of the Sahaba were about 16, 17, 18 who had accepted Islam. So you can imagine the Prophet ﷺ, who is at the end of the Meccan phase. When the Prophet began, he was 40 years old. And then at the end of the Meccan phase, 53. So you can imagine the Prophet ﷺ, slightly elder. And then around him are generally almost everyone, the 20-year-olds around him. And then the Prophet ﷺ teaching them. Because Islam is with the youth. Islam is with the youth. And when the Prophet ﷺ went to Medina now, the effort changed to mu'akhat. Now you've got these 150 to 300 of the companions who understand Islam now. Now you've got the Ansar coming into Islam through the efforts of Mus'ab ibn Umair. And they're new. They don't have knowledge. They haven't received the tarbiyah that the Meccan, that the Muhajirin have. So now the effort is mu'akhat, where a companion from the senior companion from Makkah is paired with a new convert from the Medinan stage. And then they do each other's tarbiyah like that. But you can see how the Prophet done the tarbiyah of the Muhajirin. Imagine when they were paired as brothers, imagine a Muhajir, he would say to his Ansari, now the Prophet has made them brothers, he would say to him, he would half his wealth and say, look, this wealth is for you and this wealth is for me. He would allow that new convert to stay in his house for as long as he needed. And some Sahaba even said, I have this many wives, I will divorce this, whichever one you want, and you can have this wife. This is how they were. So this is the level of sacrifice that the Prophet ﷺ had taught, and how the Prophet ﷺ done the tarbiyah of the Sahaba. And the first thing that the Prophet ﷺ done when he came to Medina is also, of course, set up the masjid. He set up the masjid to be the center of the community. So this, for us to revive Islam, and for Islam to be revived, is not done miraculously. We will make dua and Islam will be revived. There's a blueprint that's been set out in the seerah. And if we follow the blueprint, then Islam will be revived. There's everything, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a sunnah in this world. If we follow the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the same thing that happened to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba, the same things can happen to us as well. But it's about following the blueprint. And like I said, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his main investment was in the youth. The Prophet, and I was listening to a podcast recently, and the Shaykh was saying that in the middle, you have 95% of people. 95% of people in the middle. And he said that majority of the people, they're cowards. Not my words, the Shaykh. He said majority of them are cowards. They don't want to do anything, and they just follow whoever is in front of them. And then you have about 2-3% who are the good of the community, or who are very active, who are aspiring to be leaders, to lead, to become role models. And then so that's the 2-3% on the right hand side. And then you have 2-3% on the left hand side who are extremely negative. They don't want to do any good. They want to stop any good that's happening. All they want to do is criticize, condemn, and complain, and bring the ummah down. And he was saying to change an entire nation is not about changing the 95%, because they're cowards. They're not going to do anything. And he said that the Prophet ﷺ understood this. To change the entire nation, all you need to do is change the 2-3% and make them more powerful, the 2-3% that are willing to do good, and make them more powerful than the 2-3% that are trying to do negative. If you win those 2-3%, then you will won the 95%, because the 95%, they're willing to follow anyone that's in front of them. And he's saying in the final sermon of the Prophet ﷺ, there were around 100,000 to let's say 120,000. There are at least 100,000 companions there. For amongst them, we don't know the names of 75,000 of them. We've never even heard of their names. Now, for amongst the 2,500 of them, it was very few that actually understood the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Very few, you can probably count them on your hands, who understood the deen of Allah, Islam, from A to Z. It was a handful of them. Because the Sahaba, they were busy. They were farmers, they were doing different jobs. They couldn't dedicate all their time. It's only later that ilm became codified, fiqh was taught as a subject, hadith was, and so on and so on. So the Sahaba generally had scattered knowledge of Islam. Very few spent enough time with the Prophet ﷺ that during his lifetime they understood the deen fully. It's very few, you can literally count them on your fingers. For amongst those who had knowledge, like Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah rahimahullah, he says, those who are very active in passing on rulings was only about 7. Imagine, only from us 100,000 Sahaba, only 7 were very active in passing on rulings. And then those in a slightly lesser degree would be about 20 or so, and so on. And those who had narrated probably 1 or 2 rulings from the Prophet ﷺ, or even from themselves, would be another 20 or 30 or so, who has recorded to have given a ruling. So those, even from the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, those who became leaders and generals and led the Ummah and brought the change, who went on to conquer the Persian Empire, who went on to conquer the Roman Empire, is only 2-3% of the Sahaba. And the rest of the Sahaba, they just follow those 2-3%. So now, for us to bring any change, to change the community, just how the Prophet did, all we need to do is identify the 2-3% amongst us. Those who are willing to, those who have courage, those who are bravery, and those who are willing to learn and grow and benefit the Ummah. And every community will have those 2-3%. Now it's about, and that's what the Prophet did. He identified those 2-3%, nurtured them, done their tarbiyah, gave them knowledge, and then he gave them positions of leadership. And those 2-3% went on to ruling